So that's it. We shall begin with chapter 1. We're going to send another quick reminder to those of you who are just joining us right now. Please take a second to type your full name in the chat room so we can confirm your attendance. We will start with the background and the nature of financial crime. And then we shall look at each of the financial crimes as we move on. Chapter 2 is going to be about the biggest financial crime, money laundering. Chapter 3 is going to be about terrorist financing, and then we'll look at bribery, corruption, fraud, and the other financial crimes. And then we shall also cover risk, a bit on risk management. We won't dive very deeply into risk, but obviously if you're studying financial crime, which is a risk for financial institutions, you should cover at least the basics of risk and risk management. And that's what we're going to do today and tomorrow. We will dedicate a lot of time to the first chapter because we assume that some of you might be thinking of taking this exam. So we will keep that in mind. We will probably give you some tips here and there for the exam. And the reason why we concentrate so much, we give a lot of time on chapter 1, it's because just like it says, it's the background and the nature of financial crime. Everything else we're going to cover from chapter 2 upwards is linked or based on what we cover in chapter 1. So we find it incredibly important to dedicate a lot of time for it. You all work in finance, you've all taken or continuously take training in AML and financial crime. So a lot of what we're going to cover, especially in chapter 1, you're already familiar with, but please concentrate a bit on it because there are a few details, especially when it comes to international regulation in the UK, the EU, and America. These are areas that you might just have to memorize. To be honest, when it comes to laws, CISI is not going to ask you on your interpretation to the laws. That's not why you're taking these exams. CISI wants to make sure that you understand the crimes and you understand the laws linked to them. So let's begin. So let's first define financial crime. We are going to be lawyers today and tomorrow. Any crime involving money or assets with monetary value. I think somewhere in this qualification, we are going to study that 2/3 of crime in England are motivated by money. 2/3 of crime in England are motivated by money. More stats on financial crime. Corruption in Africa, third world countries. Corruption, Africa loses 1/4 of its GDP, it's over $100 billion every year because of corruption, which is a financial crime. And of course, you understand the sensitivity of working in finance when it comes to financial crime, because criminals take advantage and abuse the financial system to launder money, and politicians abuse the financial system to manipulate and clean the process of their corruption. And rich people also abuse the financial system for their advantage. So now that we've defined what is financial crime, we start with the FSMA 2000 law, the UK law that covers financial crime. And yes, you do need to sort of memorize these laws. I mean, you will be asked about them. The FSMA defines financial crime as any offense involving fraud or dishonesty. And we are going to look into detail on each of these crimes. There is a chapter for each one of them, and we are going to study them in details. We learned that the difference between fraud and theft is dishonesty. Fraud can be stealing, an employee stealing some assets from their company, a politician stealing some money from the treasury. Even though technically that is theft, but under the umbrella of financial crime, we consider this as fraud because it includes dishonesty. So we will learn as we move on in this qualification that fraud and theft are quite similar because in many cases, fraud involves stealing something which is not yours. But what differentiates them is that fraud includes an element of dishonesty. So if the other party has placed trust in you and you stole from them, that's fraud. It's no longer considered as theft, it's now considered fraud, and it goes under financial crime. And it's covered by financial crime laws. Misconduct or misuse of information related to financial market. Of course, when we talk about this, we talk about market abuse. And market abuse as defined in the the market abuse directives of the EU, covers insider trading and market manipulation, which of course we will also cover as we move on in this training. Handling of the proceeds of crime, because just because you didn't do the crime, it doesn't mean that you should help the criminal. It doesn't mean that you should conceal or in any way help that criminal take advantage of the money, even though you didn't do the crime, but you participated in the crime in one way or the other. And because of that, handling the proceeds of crime is a financial crime, is an offense by itself, as defined by the FSMA. Most of the rules and the regulations around the world, including those that came after the FSMA 2000, such as the European Union Market Abuse Directives and the European Union Money Laundering Directives, and even in the US, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act came in 2002. In one way or the other, they do have a lot of common areas with the FSMA 2000. Not just because it's a fair law, but also because regulators around the world cooperate. They meet, they share information, they share best practices, and if something makes sense and if something helps reduce crime, most countries around the world are going to bring that into their own country. So, such offenses may be carried out in their own right or in order to finance other crime, such as terrorism. So I might be stealing money because I want to steal money, I want that money, or I might be stealing money because I want to finance some terrorist group. And it's very important that you separate the two crimes. Obviously, if you steal money to finance terrorism, you've committed two crimes. And this is a particularly sensitive area when it comes to money laundering, because previously, in order to convict a criminal of money laundering, the law needed to convict the criminal for the crime that they committed that gave them the cash. So for example, if the criminal sold some drugs, which is an illegal activity, got cash, and used that cash to deposit in a bank and do money laundering, so obviously he committed two crimes: sold drugs and laundered money through the bank. Previously, in order for the law to jail that criminal for money laundering, they needed to prove or to have proof on him selling the drugs. If they couldn't prove that he was selling the drugs, they couldn't take him to jail for money laundering. That changed. So they separated the financial crime itself from the original crime that gave rise to it. That original crime that gave rise to it is called a predicate offense. So money laundering and many financial crimes, money laundering by itself is a derivative crime. That means it is based or it is a result of another crime. For you to do money laundering, you need to have dirty money. in order for you to have dirty money, you must have committed a crime. And that crime is a predicate offense. And of course, we keep saying money laundering, money laundering, money laundering, but it's not, of course, not just linked to money. You can launder any asset that you own, from commodities to real estate to any asset, of course. Now, with the advent of crypto, a lot of money laundering happening there. So laundering money is making dirty or illegal money, or let's say asset you obtained illegally, making it look clean, making it look legal. So now that we understand the need to separate the financial crime from the predicate offense, we can now move on and talk about other crimes. If you are just joining us now, please take a second to type your full name in the chat room so we can confirm your attendance. Predicate offenses. What is a predicate offense? It is a crime that generates money, and that money may become subject to money laundering, because money laundering is based on dirty money. So you can notice here that conviction for the predicate offense is not required. So just because we couldn't convict you for selling drugs, we can still convict you for money laundering. You can still go to jail for that. Obviously, if we can convict you for both, your jail sentence will double and you will pay more fines. Aim is to remove benefit of the predicate offense and so reduce levels of crime. So the need, the need to split the financial crime from the predicate offense and have them as two separate crimes basically helps you remove the benefit of the predicate offense, because the criminal would say, well, they might be able to convict me for money laundering, but they've got no evidence on me selling the drugs. So since they cannot convict me for money laundering, if they cannot convict me for selling the drugs, I'm free. No, you're not free. But they have removed the benefit of selling the drugs, because even though they cannot convict you for selling the drugs, they can still convict you for laundering the money. And that supposedly discourages drug dealers. Of course, when we talk about money laundering, don't worry, chapter 2 is all about money laundering. We're going to cover these areas in a lot more detail. The Financial Action Task Force, the Financial Action Task Force, of course, also known as its French name, GAFI. How is it spelled in French? No idea. So the Financial Action Task Force is the global intergovernmental organization responsible for, basically responsible for combating money laundering. They set guidelines referred to as recommendations. They do mutual reviews among countries, and they report directly to the UN, the United Nations. As we move on in this qualification, we will start to see the different functions of the United Nations and the different departments. The FATF reports to the United Nations. Now, of course, FATF by itself cannot take action because they're just an international organization. They can issue you with recommendations, they can review you, and they can send recommendations to the United Nations. And that's about it. The United Nations will take action. If you are found to be non-compliant or brazenly non-compliant, because they do forgive some non-compliance in some areas for certain countries. But if you're found to be brazenly non-compliant, the UN is going to put you on the sanction list, and organizations and countries will be forbidden from dealing with you. So that is that you can see the importance of FATF. What they report to the United Nations matters a lot, because they can be the reason for you getting on the sanction list. the UN relies heavily on the recommendations of FATF. FATF says countries should apply the crime of money laundering as widely as possible. What does that mean? It means mostly that the term predicate offense should cover as many crimes as possible. Let me give an example. Let's say in certain countries, market manipulation is a civil offense. It's not a crime. It's a civil offense. That means you don't go to jail. You pay a fine, and that's it for market manipulation. In other countries, market manipulation is a crime. You go to jail if you do it. You've seen that the difference in these two countries in defining and in conviction of market manipulation, they will treat money laundering differently if it comes from market manipulation. So in the first country, if somebody manipulates the market, makes money, and then tries to act in the money, well, technically, the market manipulation money isn't a criminal money. So they are not extending money laundering to a lot of offenses. One of the main offenses, market manipulation, to that country is really not a crime. Because in order for you to technically be convicted of money laundering, you should have committed a crime. You should have obtained money through criminal activity. And in certain countries, market manipulation is not really a criminal activity. It's not really a criminal offense. It's a civil offense. So that's why FATF and the UN, when they are issuing these guidelines, you will notice a lot of this term, as widely as possible. Extend the coverage of predicate offense and money laundering to as many crimes as possible. That ensures that you catch as many criminals as possible. But don't forget, FATF issues guidelines, standards. We call them recommendations. There's 40 of them. And they are technically soft law. That means FATF cannot come to our country and force us to implement them. They encourage us to implement them, but they can't force us to implement them. So they can recommend that we cover as many crimes under money laundering as possible and predicate offense, but they really can't really force us. Now there is a threshold, usually a limit, a ceiling or a floor. A threshold, so let's just write it here, a ceiling or a floor. That means a minimum or a maximum level linked to the seriousness of the offense and the penalty of the imprisonment. So for certain countries, for something to be considered a crime, you need to look at how serious it is. For certain countries, market manipulation is very serious. For other countries, like, meh, let him pay a fine and that's it. Also, that threshold can be linked to the penalty of the imprisonment. So for certain countries, they would say, for this to be considered money laundering, the crime should hold a penalty of imprisonment of 5 years or more. If he committed a crime that takes him to jail for less than 5 years, technically, we cannot really link it to money laundering, because that's considered to be a minor crime, not a major crime. FATF provides a list of predicate offenses, the ones that they recommend that we cover as widely as possible. FATF has a list of designated categories of offenses, and these must always be criminalized. Now, FATF realizes that they cannot have countries criminalize all offenses on the list. For example, like market manipulation. They can't force countries to criminalize, or they can't ask countries to criminalize all of the crimes. But there are certain crimes, like drug dealing, for example. There are certain crimes that, you as a country shouldn't really be soft on them. And that list that FATF considers should always be criminalized, that list is called the designated categories of offenses. And the two main crimes on that list are terrorist financing and proliferation finance, proliferation of weapons. Proliferation means buying and selling, spreading, proliferation weapons of mass destructions. So FATF says that all countries should consider these two activities as crimes. So anybody who does them, makes money out of them, and then tries to use that money will be considered as doing money laundering. If you are just joining us right now, please take a few seconds to type your full name in the chat room so we can take your attendance. Terrorist financing. Financing of terrorist actions or terrorist organizations. So you have dirty money that you have obtained. It might even be clean money, but you have money and you can either use that to finance terrorist actions you do yourself or your friends, or to finance terrorist organizations. So the financing of terrorism, terrorism is trying to cause hurt or death to others, to the public, usually to civilians. Because when it comes to armies, there are terms of engagement. There is a Geneva Convention, but usually terrorism is usually linked to trying to hurt civilians. Terrorism is usually linked to certain religious or ethnic movements. And the reason why FATF is adamant on making sure that terrorist financing and proliferation of weapons are considered as crime is because people can be split on what they consider terrorist. So certain organizations might be considered terrorists to some people, but they might be considered freedom fighters to other people. So just because this certain organization in your country, you think that they are heroes and they are freedom fighters, it doesn't mean that the UN and the rest of the world should consider them as heroes and freedom fighters. That's why even if these terrorist organizations are considered to be legal in certain countries, other countries and the UN can still consider them as terrorists. And of course, if they can, they will stop other countries and other organizations from dealing with them. Now, the United Nations International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism provides or defines terrorist financing as getting money to carry out terrorist activities. What are terrorist activities? These are usually defined under anti-terrorist treaties. A treaty is a usually legal binding or legally binding agreement between governments. And a terrorist action tries to cause death or a serious body injury to usually civilians and the public. Or they try to intimidate the population. They don't necessarily shoot them or kill them, but they try to scare them. Or they try to force the government to take an action. For example, they might kidnap the prime minister. And they would say, we will not give him to you until you release our leader from jail. So usually when it comes to terrorism, there's usually a reason behind that terrorist activity. The convention the UN Convention does not apply to purely national or domestic offenses. So just because it won't say, find this organization as a terrorist in this country, we will only consider them as terrorists in their country. No. Just because they are terrorists in that country, it doesn't mean that they're just terrorists in only that country. They can be terrorists all around the world. So if you are a terrorist in the country, we can still consider you as an international terrorist also. That is the financing of terrorism or terrorist financing, which we'll cover in more detail in chapter 3. Proliferation, exchanging, buying and selling, spreading, manufacturing, growing of weapons of mass destruction. For the purpose of this exam, and for general purposes, weapons of mass destruction are nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And yes, any of you taking the exam, you might be asked what really are weapons of mass destruction. Of course, if any of you are old enough, you can remember the 2003, America and Iraq, Saddam Hussein. We heard weapons of mass destruction so many times by Donald Rumsfeld and George W. Bush. So they used the international conventions on proliferation of financing to basically justify their invasion of Iraq. Nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. It's not just buying and selling them, even the means of delivering them. So, for example, nuclear weapons by itself, I mean, you can't just throw it. You need to put it on a missile, put it in a plane, or in a tank or something, and then just shoot it. So even if you're not manufacturing the actual nuclear head, if you are manufacturing the means of delivering that weapon, you're still considered as doing proliferation financing. So it's not just the actual weapon, but also the means of delivering that weapon. And not just the means of delivering that weapon, but also any related materials to it. For example, let's say, because most of these weapons, whether they are nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, many of them have some actually good uses. Nuclear, for example, can be used for clean energy. So some chemicals can be actually used for certain functions. It's only when you start to use these for illegal activities or unsanctioned activities, it's when it starts to be considered as proliferation financing. Uranium is still a mineral, can be used for many functions. The actual missile, might be used for other army needs, but it's only when you start using them for weapons of mass destruction that we basically say, no, you can't. More financial crime, fraud. And we talked a bit about it at the beginning of this session. And we said fraud is very similar to theft. Here's a quick example. If I am walking down the street and I pass through some dark alley, and a criminal pulls a knife and then says, give me your wallet, and I give him my wallet. I don't know him, he doesn't know me. He's broke and I'm having a bad day, so he stole from me. Is that fraud? No. That is theft. Why? Because we don't know each other. There is no element of trust between me and him. Another example would be an employee stealing something from the office. He's stealing something that's not his. What is that? Is that theft? No. That's now considered fraud. Why? Because the company has placed trust in that employee, and that employee should not have abused that trust. So if you're asked in the exam, and if you take the exam, you're very likely to be asked on the difference between them. The difference is with fraud, there is an element of deception. There was an element of trust, and that trust was breached. So a breach of trust. In the UK, the Fraud Act of 2006 introduces a general offense of fraud and 3 ways to commit it. How do you commit fraud? False representation. Let's say you might have sold a certain product to a client, telling him that these are the characteristics of the product, these are the benefits. Turns out to be wrong. Failing to disclose information, withholding information. There are many cases, there are many jobs where you are legally required to disclose information about certain products or services that you provide. And the fact that you do not or did not provide that information, you willingly did not disclose it, you have committed fraud. Or it can be abuse of position. I mean, let's say failing to disclose information, you might consider probably insider trading here. You did not disclose your knowledge of the material information, so you dealt on secret information, and that's insider trading. So in some way, you can consider insider trading as fraud. Abuse of position, where one is expected to safeguard another person's financial interest. If you've taken any CISI qualification before, you might have come across this term, fiduciary duty. Of course, fiduciary means trust. In financial services, our clients put their trust in us. They put their trust in us to provide them with the best advice, to provide them with the best products, to provide them with the best products that are suitable for them, and to generally work in the best interest of the client's best interest. You must have seen that in many CISI qualifications and other non-CISI qualifications. And the fact that you have abused that trust, you took advantage of the client's trust. You took advantage of the client's trust. You abused the fiduciary duties, that can be considered as fraud. So all 3 offenses that we've seen here require dishonesty. Why is it important? Because if there is no dishonesty, if there is no breach of trust, then technically this is not required. This is not considered as fraud anymore. This is now considered as theft. And of course, the laws that cover theft and fraud are very different. Of course, thieves are punished, but fraudsters are punished heavily more. Their jail sentences are longer, their fines are bigger, because fraud had an element of trust in it, and it was breached. And these 3 offenses should you're either trying to make money out of that person, or cause that person to lose money, or to avoid an obligation. You have to pay something, you defraud the other person, you escape that obligation. So even though technically you didn't make a gain, you avoided an obligation, and that's still considered as fraud.